In some ways, the DNA of murder with Paul Holes is exceptionally frustrating, but in most ways, it's pretty brilliant. This is a 10-part documentary series. At least there were 10 episodes uploaded on Now TV, which is where I watched it. And it looks at cold cases and basically looks at them in a new light because of DNA advances. I think the oldest case was 40-something years ago, and the most recent ones were maybe 15, 20 years ago. And it takes the DNA evidence from the case at the time, re-examines them where possible, and also Paul Holes studies the cases themselves and the crime scenes and, assesses them from his perspective. Now, I didn't at all know who Paul Holes was before this. He is actually a former cold case investigator, and he was partly responsible for helping to solve the Golden State Killer case, which is pretty interesting stuff. So certainly I very quickly learned to trust his opinion. I trusted the analyses he was putting out. I had a lot of confidence in the work he was doing, and certainly I will say that this show got results, but it also didn't. And that's one of the things that annoyed me. And I will talk about that in a moment. But just, first of all, the structure of each episode is pretty similar across the board, but each episode is very different. I found that they were exploring very different aspects of DNA in each episode, and I found that very refreshing, and very unique, and very interesting. For example, we had a case that looked at hog tying and what that could mean about the offender, about the perpetrator. There was a case that involved somebody they committed several murders and they only ever took the knives from the victims' homes and what that could mean. There was this whole thing about toothpaste, which I found to be really fascinating. It's not something I'd ever come across in any of the true crime cases I've looked at before. And each of these cases were new to me, apart from one. There was one case that I was aware of, and it's about Carla Walker. And I'm actually going to use that case to explain why this frustrates me, but why it's also a really good thing. But I'll leave that towards the end, as I don't really want to spoil anything. Very informative show. I learned a lot. I've seen probably hundreds of hours of true crime documentaries and series and episodes. And I still managed to learn some things in here, particularly the aspect about hog tying. That's not something I would have picked up on, so that's something that I found really interesting. And the episode takes us through the history of the case, what conclusions, if any, were reached at the time, and it also says what DNA we still have left to test now and what can be retested, and if there were any suspects at the time, are they still alive? Can they do a DNA match with any new findings? And Paul Holes talks with, victims, family members, friends, people who knew them at the time, gets a better understanding of the case, and by the end of each episode's about an hour in length, I personally felt like I had a good understanding of the victim's life, who they were as a person, and where possible, what could have happened for the perpetrator to actually kill them, if there were any potential reasons behind that. Obviously, being cold cases, none of that was 100% accurate. We don't know for certain, but it's really interesting to actually have a potential motive and, something that was perhaps not mentioned when the case first came to light. So that's really good. We also get to see some crime scene footage or photos, and they are relatively graphic. To go back to the hog tying one, we got to see the feet of the individual who had been hog tied, and his feet had been flogged as well, and we got to see a very close-up photo of his feet post-mortem, and it was very detailed. No faces though. To the best of my recollection, there were no faces, so even though the scenes were quite graphic, we didn't see anybody's face post-mortem that I recall. So that's something I like. We got to hear from a lot of different professionals who had different areas of expertise. I felt like everybody's opinion was trustworthy, and I didn't really there was nobody who spoke who I thought, well, actually, I'm not sure I trust your opinion on this. Everybody felt like they could have been trusted and could have contributed quite valuably to this. Really enjoy it. Very well edited together. As I said, a great range of cases, apart from none of which I'd heard of, apart from the one that I will talk about in a moment. I honestly cannot complain. I actually truly, well, I can't complain, and I will in a moment, but I truly adored each episode. There were two things that bugged me, though. First is that there were two different women, one more than the other, neither of whose names I wrote down, but they both talked over Paul Holes constantly and finished his sentences for him, and it's so infuriating when you're watching it. It's just like, let him finish talking. You know, you don't need to butt in, you don't need to interrupt, it's rude, and I no longer respect you as a person. But their opinions I still, on the cases, still respected. So that was annoying. The other really annoying thing is that there were no conclusions. In all of these cases, it just ends abruptly. It's like, well, we think we could do this, we think we could get that, we've got a good chance of finding this, and then the episode's over and that's it. And they haven't solved the case, they've just kind of reopened it and maybe pushed it a little bit further forward. And that's so annoying when you're watching this case and they're so close to potentially solving it, having the killer, you know, getting justice for the family, and then the episode just ends. And as a viewer, that is so frustrating. But as a member of the family, I imagine it's still a really positive thing, because they're putting these cases back into the public attention. People may, you know, have memories jogged. Even if this was the worst documentary in the world, which it's not, it's really enjoyable. Putting cold cases back into the public attention is always going to be a good thing, mostly always a good thing, because it's going to say, look, this isn't solved yet. If you have anything that you withheld however many years ago, please come forward, and that's always a good thing. But it is frustrating when you're watching it. But I will say, there was the case of Carla Walker, who was abducted and murdered in 1974. She went to, I think, a Valentine's Day dance with her boyfriend. She was abducted from the car and murdered. She was 17 years old. And I don't know how much this particular TV show contributed to this, but there has actually been a suspect arrested since then. And this was only at the end of November, so at the end of last year in November, so I'm not sure quite how far that case has gone. I haven't looked too much into it at the moment. But the fact that they finally arrested somebody and charged them, allegedly charged them, 40-something years later it's incredible, So if the show had anything to do with that, then that is amazing. Really is amazing. So I do thoroughly recommend you watch it. It's very informative. I learned some things. It's something that I would probably watch again if they did more episodes. In fact, I definitely would. But just bear in mind that in each of the episodes, they don't actually solve anything. So it's a bit frustrating. But ultimately, the DNA of Murder with Paul Holes is something that I really enjoyed, and I do recommend it.